Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Goodness. How do you feel about being a woman in Afghanistan? The Taliban, the current rulers of Afghanistan, have violated women and girls' rights to education. At least 1.4 million school-age Afghan girls of their right to education are no longer attending schools. Women and girls' right to work and free movement has been violated as well. Demolish the system of protection and support for women and girls fleeing domestic violence. Arbitrarily detaining women and girls for violations of the Taliban's discriminatory rules. As a result, contributing to a surge in the rate of child and early forced marriage in Afghanistan. Within an year of its takeover of Afghanistan in 2021, the group's draconian policies are depriving millions of women and girls of the opportunity to lead safe, free, and fulfilling lives. One woman put it as to death in slow motion. Have things been better in the past prior to the takeover by Taliban in 2021? Afghanistan and its rulers and their impact on the rights of women are a changing and a challenging and sometimes a disturbing topic for many. Afghanistan has been through changing political landscape, in particular in the last 50 years. Women have been campaigning for their rights and made some gains and suffered significant setbacks. The country has been occupied by Soviet troops and US-led international forces, and in the years in between has been ruled by militant groups including Taliban. At the end of it all, Afghan women were the ones who lost most from the war and militarization. Pre-Islamic history of Afghanistan looked like this: spans numerous religions and cultures, shaped by the rich tribal tapestry of its inhabitants, as well as occupying empires. In the period of 1800 to 1900, Afghan women became eligible to vote in 1919. Only a year after, women in UK were given voting rights, and a year before, the women in United States were given those rights. In 1921, the first school for girls opened in Afghanistan by then King Ahmadullah Khan. The king's history was enriched by his wife, Queen Saraya Tazi, who played a major role in the opening of the school, who actively supported women's education. The king has been marked in the history as someone who introduced significant reforms in the country. In between 1929 and 1973, in this period, various kings ruled the country. In 1950, Afghanistan abolished the Purdah system, which had enforced strict gender segregation and veiling practices. It granted women the greater personal and societal freedoms, allowing them to participate more actively in public life. In 1964, adoption of the Constitution of Afghanistan that focused on women's rights, but progress was slow. Between 1978 and 1992, during the communist era led by the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, some progress was made in terms of women's rights, such as the right to education and employment. Conflict between Mujahideen groups, government forces, and others from 1970s became a turning point in the 20th century, when progress for women's rights in Afghanistan started to become undone. Between 1992 and 1996, following the Soviet withdrawal, various Mujahideen fractions fought for control of Afghanistan. During this time, women's rights were not a priority, and many women faced violence and repression. many women lost the rights they had gained during the communist era, such as the right to education and employment. They were also forced to wear burqas and were not allowed to leave their homes without male guardian. Rise of Taliban happened between 1996 to 2001. The armed group was founded in 1994 during the civil war that followed the Soviet Union's withdrawal from Afghanistan. Led by Mullah Muhammad Omar, the Taliban captured Kabul in 1996 and ruled almost of Afghanistan until 2001. The Taliban, a Sunni Islamic fundamentalist movement, took control of Afghanistan in 1996 and imposed a strict interpretation of Islamic law. Women were denied basic rights such as the right to education and employment. Women were also banned from working and girls were banned from attending school. Between 2001 to 2021, US and coalition forces in cooperation with Afghan forces from the Northern Alliance invaded Afghanistan in 2001 and ousted the Taliban from power. Following the fall of Taliban in 2001, a new constitution was adopted that provided for equal rights for women. While women were allowed to work and attend school, they still faced significant barriers in terms of access to education and employment. They also faced significant social and cultural barriers, such as the persistence of traditional attitudes towards women's roles and rights. The Afghan parliament passed a law on the elimination of violence against women, criminalizing certain forms of violence against women. In 2013, a comprehensive strategy to improve the status of women in Afghanistan was developed by the Afghan government. It aimed to eliminate violence against women, promote women's access to justice, improve women's economic empowerment, and increase women's participation in political and public life. Its implementation was hindered by lack of political will and insufficient resources. Despite changes, it helped increase the number of women in decision-making positions and provide more access to education, healthcare, and justice for women. It is very evident from the history that Afghanistan has a dark past when it comes to women and girls' rights, way before the Taliban rule. Women's rights in Afghanistan were limited and traditional societal attitude towards women's roles and rights persisted. Women were largely confined to domestic roles and had limited access to education and employment. They were also subject to discriminatory laws and practices, such as the forced marriage of young girls and the denial of inheritance rights. After the Taliban were removed from power in 2001, steady and significant progress was made in girls' access to education, particularly at the secondary level, with nearly 40% of the girls enrolled in school in 2018 compared to 6% in 2003. Still, before the Taliban seized control of the country, Afghanistan had one of the biggest gender gaps in education levels in the world. This was due to several interconnected factors, including prolonged conflict, the discriminatory norms and practices regarding the role of women and girls in the society. These factors led to the context where, prior to 2021, only 37% of teenage girls could read and write compared with the boys, which was like 66%. Here, Taliban are back in power in 2021. Despite extensive and portrayed military operations by the US-led coalition and Afghan national security forces, the Taliban gradually regained territory and expanded their influence in Afghanistan. In February 2020, the USA and the Taliban signed an agreement laying out a timeline for the final withdrawal of all US and NATO forces from Afghanistan. In exchange, the Taliban agreed to prevent Al-Qaeda from operating in areas under Taliban control and to engage in talks with the Afghan government. The agreement failed to address any protections for women's rights, and women's rights activists and organizations were largely excluded from the negotiation that led to the agreement. The USA and NATO had withdrew almost all of their forces during a bloody nationwide offensive. The Taliban took control of their first provincial capital, Zaranji, through other major cities over to the next 9 days and finally taking over Kabul. Since the withdrawal of the international troops in 2021, Taliban has regained significant territory and influence in Afghanistan, becoming the de facto leaders of the now called Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. The Taliban enforced their version of Islamic Sharia law. The situation for women's rights in once again deteriorated at a significant pace, erasing a decade of progress made in the country. In the area of education, the Taliban had prevented the vast majority of girls at the secondary level from returning to school. At the university level, though, the Taliban's harassment of female students, as well as restrictions on students' behaviors, dress code, and opportunity, have contributed to an unsafe environment where female students are systematically disadvantaged compared to male students. As a result, many female students have either stopped attending or decided not to enroll in university. Other challenges affect girls' and women's access to education at all levels, including restrictions on their movement. Teachers' shortages and students' lack of motivation due to limited career options under the Taliban. According to the Afghans' T20 cricket captain Rashad, education holds a central place in Islamic teaching, emphasizing the pursuit of knowledge for both men and women. The Quran highlights the importance of learning and acknowledges the equal spiritual worth of both genders. He urged the Taliban to reconsider the ban on women's access to medical education and training, terming the move deeply unjust, and believe the acute shortage of female doctors and nurses is particularly concerning, as it directly impacts the healthcare and dignity of women. Women in workforce. The Taliban have prevented women across Afghanistan from working. Particularly in the government sector, most female government employees have been told to stay at home, with the exception those working in certain sectors such as health and education. In private sector, many women have been dismissed from high-level positions. The Taliban's policy appears to be that they will allow only women who cannot be replaced by men to keep working. The women have continued working are finding it extremely difficult in the face of Taliban restrictions on their clothing and behavior, such as a requirement for female doctors to avoid treating male patients or interacting with male colleagues. So what is the future for those who are a sole and primary wage earner for the family? Now, this is merely more than a women's rights conversation, or has it passed that point and have become a humanitarian disaster or a crisis, contributing to economic collapse, food insecurity, collapse of humanitarian and women's rights organization, poverty in Afghanistan? So freedom in movement. Initially, they ordered women and girls to be accompanied by the mahram, a male chaperone for long distance journeys. Most recently, they decreed the women should not leave their home unless necessary. Adhering to the dress code, Afghan Ministry of Vice and Virtue issued an announcement requiring women to cover themselves from head to toe. Male family members were made responsible for women's adherence to the new rules and can be detained if women and girls in the family refuse to comply. Now, gender-based violence response. Before 2021, women and girl survivors of gender-based violence had access to a national-wide network of shelters and services, including legal representation, medical care, and psychological support. Specialized Precautions Unit and court dealt with cases involving violence against women and girls. While the system had its limitation, it served thousands of women and girls each year. As the Taliban took control of Afghanistan, the system collapsed. Shelters were closed and many were looted and appropriated by members of the Taliban. In some cases, Taliban members harassed or threatened staff. As shelters closed, staff were forced to send many women and girl survivors back to their families. Their survivors were forced to live with shelter staff members on the street or in other unsustainable environments. Incomprehensibly, as the Taliban advanced across the country, they also systematically released detainees from prisons, many of whom had been convicted of gender-based violence offenses. Arbitrary detention of women and girls for moral corruption and feeling abuse. Taliban-run detention centers. The Taliban had arbitrarily arrested and detained women and girls for violating their discriminatory policies, such as rules against appearing in public without a mahram for a man, or appearing in public with a man who does not qualify as a mahram. So those arrested have usually been charged with a vague and ambiguous crime of moral corruption. They have been denied access to legal counsel and subject to torture and other ill treatment as well as inhuman conditions in detention. A university student who has been detained in Afghanistan said the following: Taliban members started giving me electric shocks with a taser on my shoulder, face, neck, everywhere they could. They were calling me a prostitute and the B word. And one holding the gun said, "I will kill you and no one will be able to find your body." Her detention would stigmatize her for life. For an Afghan girl, going to prison is no less than death. Once you enter the door, you are labeled and you cannot erase it. That's her story. This goes to show the social cultural stigma associated with womanhood is inseparable from their daily lives. Child early and forced marriages. The rates of child early forced marriages in Afghanistan are surging under Taliban rule. The most common drivers include the economic and humanitarian crisis, the lack of educational and professional prospects for women and girls, families' perceived need to protect their daughters from marriages with the Taliban member, families forcing women and girls to marry Taliban member, Taliban members forcing women and girls to marry them. Stories of locals goes like this. One mother said she had been forced to marry her 13-year-old daughter to her 30-year-old neighbor a couple of years ago in exchange for a bride price of 60,000 Afghanis, around $670. She said after marrying her daughter off, she felt relieved she wouldn't be hungry anymore. So, after all this, you might ask, why didn't the women get on the street to protest, to ask for their right back? Well, this is for you. One woman who participated in several peaceful protests was arrested and detained for 10 days in 2022. And she described her treatment during the detention. The Taliban guards kept coming to my room and showing me pictures of my family. They kept repeating, "We can kill them, all of them, and you won't be able to do anything. Don't cry, don't make a scene. After protesting, you should have expected us dead like this." She said while in the detention, she was severely beaten on 2 occasions and they locked the door, she said. They started screaming at me. One Taliban member said, "You nasty woman. America isn't giving us the money because of you bitches." This goes to show that no takeovers and unrest are merely one group specific. There is always a link with an international community. And she continued, "Then he kicked me. It was so strong that my back was injured, and he kicked my chin too. I still feel the pain in my mouth. It hurts whenever I want to talk." So women protesters who were detained by the Taliban have said they had inadequate access to food, water, ventilation, sanitary products, and medical care. To secure their release, the women were forced to sign agreements that they and their family members would neither protest again nor speak publicly about their experiences during detention. There are warriors in any community leading revolutions in the most silent way. A former staff member of an NGO providing education and support to orphans. Since the Taliban's takeover, she has set up a network of underground schools for girls from rural areas in Afghanistan who wanted to continue studying at the secondary level. Here's what she has to say. "It's underground in houses. We wanted them to be educated no matter what. We have fear all the time that the Taliban will find out what we are doing. This is why we have to be low profile. Even my family doesn't know what I do. The neighbors don't know who the girls are. We introduce them as our relatives. For the girls in our schools, of course, everything has changed. They do not want to be hopeless. I feel overwhelmed and emotionally wrecked, but I see that at least I'm able to help those many girls. This is my hope." So what does the future hold for Afghanistan? Will the Taliban respond to the below? Respect, protect, and fulfill the human rights of women and girls in accordance with its obligations under international law, including but not limited to the Convention of the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women and the Convention on the Rights of a Child, to which Afghanistan is a state party. Reinstate the Ministry of Women Affairs and the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission, and the list continues. Will Taliban be able to respond to that? Or will the rest of the world respond to this outcry? The world doesn't hear or see what's happening to us because they are not affected themselves. Only if it has happened to them would they understand, says a woman. States and international organizations must send a clear, coordinated, and resounding messages to the Taliban. And their current policies on women and girls will never be accepted, and take concrete steps that impose consequences on the Taliban for their conduct. Such steps should include identifying and using forms of leverage that may influence the Taliban without harming the Afghan people, such as targeted sanctions or travel bans applied through a UN Security Council resolution. This is their hope. Donor states must urgently address the humanitarian economic crisis unfolding in Afghanistan, which they had a role in creating and which also undermines the rights of women and girls, says a few. Donor states must ease existing financial restrictions on Afghanistan, which are blocking the provision of healthcare, food, and other essential services, and says a few. They must also strengthen the system for an equitable and adequate distribution of urgent financial support and humanitarian aid in consultation with UN agencies. NGOs and humanitarian agencies operating in Afghanistan, local women activists and organizations supporting other at-risk groups all should start functioning again. This is their hope. The stakes could not be higher if these are not set up. And the people goes to say, and particularly the women, if the international community failed to act, it will abandon millions of women and girls across Afghanistan and embolden others to undermine the human rights of women and girls around the world. These are my questions to all of you for you to think deeply. Are the hands of the international community tied? Because they are aware there are underhand dealing between the powerful country and the Taliban that keep the Afghanistan women and children in this state. Or simply the international community do not see any value in being involved as there is not much to take home from Afghanistan, is it? Again, I take you back to one of my previous podcasts in which I refer the possibility of United Nations slowly losing its grip in the humanitarian arm of its organization. What will the world look like in the event of UN collapse? And some say, but the UN has already started to collapse a long time ago. So with this, who is going to take care of the humanitarian crisis and the disasters that are unfolding around the world? A new model, a new concept, a new order has to be established. Otherwise, everyone will be running around like a headless chook, and we will be seeing lots of women and children in this instant will be starting to lose their lives. Not physically, mentally, they'll be harmed for generations to come. I will leave you here. Let you ponder on that. Until then, you look after yourself, and I will meet you in another episode of Goodness. Thank you.
Why did they let only us go, Mr. Anu?
Because you are tourists, madam. This is the place that King Ravana lived, and he is also buried. One day he will wake up and save Sri Lanka.
Like it?
Love it.
There we go. Thank you for spending 5 years of your life with me.
To us.
Mr. Andrew, we got robbed. Where were you?
You sure it's them, Kishan?
ആ ജനൽ ശരിക്കും അടച്ചായിരുന്നില്ലേ?
Panda uttai.
We are not safe here, sir.
Don't go there, sir. They will kill you.
Kill who?
Kill you, me, madam, all.
How can you be so happy, Amma?
You want me to be unhappy?
Do you think when women face problems, they cry and hope for a man to rescue them?
Aren't we also responsible?
How are we responsible for it?
This is human life. Doesn't it have any value? Randu, now might be a good time for Ravana to wake up from his slumber and save Lanka. Let